next speaker, which is Katrina Rosenberger. She's PhD in our project on the impact of domestication and learning, on learning and cognitive capacity in goats. And she's especially interested in the effects of long-term cognitive training on livestock welfare and husbandry. And Katrina is PhD student in Switzerland under the supervision of Nina Keil from Agroscope. So, Katrina, the stage is yours. Please give us your talk.
Thanks. I will try first share this with you. Does everybody hear me?
Yes.
And you can see my screen.
Yes.
Perfect. So thanks for the introduction, Jan. I'm happy to be here and be able to talk to you today about actually the main results of my PhD work over the last almost 4 years. Oh my God. And I will talk about cognitive testing as a form of cognitive enrichment for farm animals and its welfare outcomes, or what we detected, and their possible relevance for housing. So let me first start with, why do we need cognitive enrichment? Animals, specifically farm animals in captivity, are often housed in very barren farm environments with very little stimulation, especially cognitive stimulation. They cannot use their specific species-specific behaviors, such as rooting in pigs or browsing. We've heard that before in goats. So they also have very much control over their environment, and this can lead to frustration and boredom. So cognitive enrichment is a form of environmental enrichment. We have heard also a lot about it today. Thanks, Faye. It is supposed to stimulate cognitive processes. It allows some control over the environment, and it is usually correlated to some welfare aspect. And it is implemented by the introduction of a cognitively enriching task in the animal's environment. These are some examples of devices that have been used for farm animals. We've just heard it by Christian Manteuffel. For example, a coal feeding station has been used to enrich pigs, and it has been shown that changes in heart rate and heart rate variability occur, but also the pigs showed increased exploration and reduced fearfulness in a novel arena test. Similarly, in goats, a computer-controlled learning device has been used to enrich them cognitively. And again, changes in heart rate and heart rate variability were found, but also increased curiosity towards a novel object. So we can clearly see that cognitive stimulation can have positive effects on the enriched animals, and it may even help them to better adapt and cope with future challenging situations. So in order to be able to use these devices, a lot of times animals have to undergo training. Not in the case like our previous coal feeding station, if this process is automated, but a lot of times human training is involved and the animals have to be isolated in novel environments. This is making it difficult to disentangle actual effects of the cognitive stimulation that we want to see from confounding factors such as the human or the habituation to the device or isolation. So yeah, we cannot be sure, do we really see cognitive testing effects? Is it the human plus the positive association with food that is usually provided? Or is it actually the environment that the animal has habituated to? And as you've heard yesterday from Christian, one part of our project was to assess cognitive skills of goats in several object choice tasks and visual discrimination learning tasks. So we used these tests, these long-term cognitive tests, as a model to assess the effect of cognitive enrichment in goats. So what was our research question? Specifically, we wanted to see if cognitive testing affects the reactivity towards isolation, novelty, and humans in a novel arena test, a novel object test, a novel human test, and a weighing test. But also we wanted to assess if cognitive flexibility is improved by this regular cognitive stimulation. And we tested this in an A-not-B detour test and a problem-solving task. I will go over the slide really quickly because, yeah, I used the same subjects that Christian Nawroth already mentioned yesterday. We used dwarf and dairy goats at 2 different locations, in Ettenhausen, Switzerland, and in Dummersdorf, Germany. We tried to use the same handling management procedures at both locations. The thing that is different now from Christian's talk is he only looked at this green part here, the cognitively trained group. So these animals received cognitive training by human presented object choice tasks, and they were provided food for correct answers. And now we have a second treatment group. This is the POS treatment, which only received rewards by the experimenter in the same arena where the cognitively tested animals were isolated for the tests, but they did not have to go through these tests, so they just received food. This allowed us to control for the effect of, or to disentangle the cognitive stimulation effect from the effect of positive human-animal interaction and isolation. And the last group, the ESO group, was isolated in the same environment, so in the same room like the tester group, but they did not receive food in this room and did not receive positive human contact. So we just left in this room for the same amount of time. And this allowed us to disentangle the isolation from the positive human-animal interaction. Good, so first, reactivity towards isolation, novelty, and humans. I mentioned already the 4 tests that we used. You see pictures here of our arena and the weighing scales that we used. Because we recorded a lot of parameters, we used PCA to reduce them into principal components. The ones in red, I will now go into detail. So the reactivity towards isolation in the novel arena, the boldness in the novel object, and the sociability in the novel human test. In the weighing test, we only found 1 main component that explained most of the variation. So this is the reactivity towards handling. So these are the results for the novel arena test. On the x-axis, you see the treatment groups. In green, the cognitive treatment. In violet, the POS treatment, and in orange, the ESO treatment again. Blue are the dairy goats, and red are the dwarf goats. And on the y-axis, you see the reactivity score towards isolation. In this test, unfortunately, we did not find differences between our treatment groups. However, we found differences within or between selection lines. Namely, as you can see here, the dairy goats always had higher reactivity scores than the dwarf goats. In the novel object test, here on the y-axis, you see the boldness score now. The rest is the same. We did not find differences in dairy goats between treatments, but in dwarf goats, we saw that the POS treatment differed from the ESO treatment. They had higher scores than ESO goats, and this also made them very much alike the dairy goats. So they were the only group that reached similar levels of boldness like dairy goats did in this test. Sorry, I'm missing a slide here and I have no idea why it is supposed to be there. Oh no, sorry, I don't know what happened to this one. Maybe because I really want to show it.
It's hidden. Click right and untick the
Oh, here, huh? No. Sorry, Christian, how can I untick it?
I think click right on the slide, on the
Right.
small icon of the slide.
No.
No, the 10 is crossed, so I don't know how to.
Yeah, I can see it, but no idea. Okay, so sorry for that, but what I wanted to show you here is that in the novel human test, the sociability score was not different between treatment groups, but again, the dairy goats had very high scores and higher than the dwarf goats. And in the reactivity towards handling, so in the weighing test, we found that treatments were different only within dwarf goats. Again, no differences within treatments in dairy goats. So within the dwarf goats, you can see here that the post-treatment has pretty high scores and higher than the cognitive treatment group and the ISO group in this test.
Can you go back to presentation mode?
No, because this slide is not showing up in presentation mode. Sorry, I'll only do it for this slide.
Okay.
And between selection lines, again, because the post group in dwarfs had very high reactivity towards handling scores, they were even higher than the ones of dairy goats. So now I will go back in presentation mode. Sorry for that. So in conclusion, for these tests, we did not find that cognitive testing reduced reactivity compared to other treatments. But surprisingly, we saw that the positive treatment, at least in dwarf goats, increased their reactivity towards handling and also increased their boldness. This increased reactivity maybe sounds weird now, but I suppose that it is because the dwarf goats were less shy in this group and thus showed less freezing. So we just scored them higher because they were moving more in the scales. And differences between selection lines, I mentioned it, dairy goats had higher reactivity towards isolation. They had higher boldness scores and higher sociability scores than dwarf goats. I told you that we also wanted to assess cognitive flexibility. We did this in an A not B test where we had a goat to detour a fence in 4 trials. Then the fence was moved to the other side. So the gap was suddenly on the other side. And these were called B trials. And it is assumed that animals show a perseveration error in this test, going first to the previously open side until they find out that actually now it's the other side that they have to choose. And in the problem-solving test, goats had in 5 trials the possibility to approach and open a container that they knew, but which was now covered with a novel lid that they have not seen before. And we just counted how many approaches did they show and how often did they open this device. These are the results for the A not B test. Again, we did not find differences between our treatment groups, between POS, COG, or ISO, but all groups showed the perseveration error that we expected. Here, for example, you can see in dairy goats, sorry, I should explain first. Bottom, you see dairy goats. On the top, you see the dwarf goats. Left-hand side is Ettenhausen and right-hand side is Dummersdorf. And the y-axis is showing you the number of trials where goats had a correct response. So it shows the correct way around the fence. And in dairy goats, for example, you can see in the A trials that 7 out of 8 individuals were correct in all 4 trials. Whereas in the B trials, for example, in the cognitive group, in only 1 individual had all 4 trials correct, whereas the rest had more between 2 and 3 trials correct. So they all had troubles, at least in the first bee trial, to find the correct way. Regarding the problem-solving test, same or very similar graph, but this time on the y-axis, you see the number of trials where goats touched the container. Again, we did not find treatment differences, and you will probably already see why. We found huge variation between selection lines, but also between sites. For example, here in Dummersdorf, none of the ESO goats of the dwarfs touched the container. And in general, less goats in Dummersdorf touched it than in Ettenhausen. We also wanted to see how many goats opened the container. Again, huge differences between selection lines. We could not even analyze dwarf goats because none of the dwarf goats, neither at Dummersdorf nor at Ettenhausen, opened the container ever. So we could only analyze dairy goats' responses. And even there, you can see there's huge variation between the two sites with a lot less goats in Dummersdorf opening the container. So in sum, we can see that cognitive flexibility in an A not B was not improved by our treatment of cognitive testing. Problem-solving ability was not improved. Again, I want to emphasize that maybe the stress of isolation was the reason. I mean, all goats have been habituated, but anyways, we could see signs of stress in some goats. So maybe it just hampered their flexibility and ability to get in touch with the device, especially in the problem-solving task. And we found huge individual variation differences between selection lines and sites that accounted for large amounts of the variation. This is already taking me to my discussion. So in sum, we can say that cognitive testing obviously is not perceived as cognitive enrichment by the goats. We did not see the expected effects in stress reactivity or in behavioral flexibility. However, we did see that the post-treatment increased boldness and reactivity of dwarf goats, which might be of relevance for housing if we think of the fact that dwarf goats seem to be more shy than dairy goats. So maybe especially shy individuals benefit from positive human contact. And we should also consider that cognitive testing was maybe perceived as aversive, at least in the previous stages where goats made mistakes and probably were frustrated. Because otherwise we would have seen similar effects in POS and COG. So something has happened in the cognitive tested goats. And also our results emphasize that reproducibility can be very difficult in these cognitive tests if we don't do multi-lab studies, because as our results show, high variation between sites and selection lines can occur. And if we only test on single sites or we only test single populations, we will not be able to notice that maybe in a different location we would get totally different results. Oh, one thing I want to add, the differences between dwarf and dairy goats might be also related to rearing conditions. The dwarf goats were reared by their dams, while the dairy goats were pretty much removed from their mothers after birth. And we know from previous or other literature that human-reared animals are usually more social towards humans than dam-reared animals. So this might be a confounding factor as well. Good. This was it from my side. Thanks for listening in, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Okay, thank you, Katrina, for this excellent talk. We have a lot of time for questions, so I'm waiting for raised hands from the auditorium, please. Yes, Sandra.
Yes, thanks very much for this presentation, Katrina. I'm sure you have discussed and maybe you want to share ideas on what's so different between Dummersdorf and Ettenhausen.
Yeah, indeed, we have brainstormed a lot about that. It might be various reasons, and probably it is the combination of a lot of things. So first of all, to me, the biggest difference that may account a lot of the variation we found is that in Ettenhausen, the goats had even more environmental stimulation than the goats in Dummersdorf, just because of logistics. In Dummersdorf, we had the possibility to make all these tests within the same building, right? As you know, while in Ettenhausen, we did not have this opportunity. We had to actually cross the whole farm area to go from one building on the one corner to the building on the other side of the farm. And even during this, just crossing this field, the goats experienced so many things like sound, smells, other people that sometimes crossed, even dogs, you know, we had everything. So maybe this environmental simulation was so high and caused differences within our treatments that we could actually not detect any differences caused by the cognitive testing anymore. And also, of course, we know that stockmanship has a huge effect on animals. So I don't know, maybe animal care staff in Dummersdorf treated animals differently than the care staff in Ettenhausen. And then, as I said, the dwarf goats, well, they were all bred in Dummersdorf, right? So part of them, the first batch that we tested had to be transported to Ettenhausen. So also this, you know, there's so many factors that, or experiences that these goats made that could have already resulted in huge differences between the individuals. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Further questions? Seems everyone's a bit tired after 1.5 days of quite interesting
afternoon.
Let me see. There's a clapping hand from Luigi. Maybe that is a question. If you want to ask a question, Luigi, open your microphone.
It was not a question. I was just congratulating with your hair about the talk.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay.
Jean-Loup, I think, is.
Oh, I'm sorry. Jean-Loup, if you.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, it was on purpose.
Okay, sorry, I didn't follow it.
No, it's okay, and I just did it now. It's been a very interesting presentation, and I really like your comment on the reproducibility of results. And I mean, I know a little bit about your project, and I know you have been testing this repopulation of goats, but I guess it's always difficult when you try different population and you don't find a uniform response, because any question is reproducibility. But at the same time, what is the minimal amount of population that we should test, or what is a good way to approach this question that, at least when we try to make it reproducible, we get an answer whether it was or it was not, and not just, maybe it is not. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's actually a very good question, because I don't know if anybody could actually answer this. Like, what is the minimum or maximum that we have to test in order to be sure that we actually properly assessed, for example, a cognitive skill that animals possess or don't possess. I think it is more important to have it in mind that a lot of the surroundings can cause effects and not just the treatment. And I don't think so much that it's important that we now conduct the same test at 50 different farms, but more remind ourselves that, especially in cognitive research, we have to be very cautious with our interpretation, because also, as you saw that in dwarf goats, like, they never opened the container And me and Christian were very surprised and actually looked at one goat afterwards, like if they are actually capable of doing it. So we put her in front of this container again, and she was totally fine doing it. So they can do it, but it just shows that it is so important to maybe, well, yeah, consider the selection line or the breed, because they are just more stressed by novel things, and they maybe would have needed even more habituation than we already gave them. Or maybe back to the isolation problem, I loved Faye's talk because of that. I would also much more be for testing animals in groups, because it's just not natural for a herd animal to be isolated. It's just such a stressful situation, and it's definitely not giving us a complete picture of its skills. So I think, we just have to keep in mind that it is difficult to do these cognitive tests in the settings we do now, and that maybe our results are not as transferable as we thought they are.
I saw like a following up question, and it's switching a bit the focus, but also, I mean, especially in cognition, there are many experiments when you have 2-3 animals, and it's like, okay, one of them does something. It's like, okay, so then this species is able to do it, right? And I know there's a lot of debate in the field of cognition, is that, for example, if you also train an animal to do something, do they understand it, and will they have done it naturally? But I guess you also question, so if you test 200 animals and one of them shows this very high cognitive ability, does that mean that when we talk about welfare, you should consider all the animals having the potential to be as smart as this one? Or like, should we make our welfare requirement according to the genius in the group, according to the Einstein of the goats? Or should we make it according to the average population, which may not be as smart as this particular goat, right?
Yeah, very good point. I totally agree. And yeah, that's why I think Faye mentioned it too. That's why it would be great to have, if we use cognitive enrichment devices, have the option for modulates, right? That animals can, choose kind of their own level that they want to reach or are able to reach, right? And they're probably happy with that, because if we assume that they can do as well as the Einstein goat, then they're probably just frustrated, and we don't do them any good by providing this enrichment device, forcing them to do something that they have not learned or are maybe just not motivated to do. Like we had goats that would like just, open and close gates and stuff just because of the fun of it. They just loved it. Well, whereas others are, maybe less interested in exploring, and that is probably a lot due to different personality traits. So again, personality has to be included in all these approaches too.
Okay, thanks. And so we have time for a last question asked by Sandra. Please try to formulate it in a short way.
Yeah, and luckily it's connected to the last answer. Do you think, because you also did contra-freeloading research, so do you think this might be like the ideal solution for practice, that you offer them to either work for it or not, so that the Einsteins can use the learning device while the not Einsteins can just like get their resources without having to do the cognitive work for it?
Absolutely. I think we should include more choice or preference tests anyways, give animals choices to, also maybe go to different areas of the barn where they can maybe just, sleep and retreat from others. And this is the same, I think, for cognitive stimulation. Yes, we should just give them the choice. And if they want to use it, they can. And if not, it's fine. They are not deprived of food, right? That's also what we did in our contra-freeloading test. We did not deprive them of food, but they were willing to work anyways. So, and definitely provided in a group setting, right? So I would definitely go for something where they don't need to leave the group, because then again, you will have the effect that certain individuals, especially very social ones, dominant ones, will not leave their group and yeah, look for this device.
Okay. Thank you, Katrina, for your talk, and thanks everyone who asked questions. We are perfectly in time.